A very quick, brief bio of, to introduce Yang Xiaoping. She is assistant professor in security and foreign relations at the Institute of Asia-Pacific Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And Yang's paper title is The Security Architecture of South Asia, Problems and Prospects. And we have two discussants, Dr. Ling, who is Associate Professor at the Graduate Program in International Affairs at the Milano School of International Affairs Management and Urban Policy, and also an ICI Fellow. And the second discussant is Professor Madhu Bhalla, a professor at the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Delhi, with whom, as I mentioned, we worked very closely to organize the symposium in Delhi. And since we have a lot of ground to cover and we are hopelessly out of time, I would like to request our discussants and authors to really keep to the time limit. Thank you. Lily?
Thank you. Given the fact that we are hopelessly running out of time, I'm going to give a very brief representation of the paper and then my critiques. The paper is an attempt to look at the security architecture in South Asia. And it begins with two premises. One is that the South Asian region is relatively closed and that it is fraught with asymmetry and fragmentation. The author then proceeds to look at three dimensions of the security architecture. The first one is power. And here, the author defines power according to Indian predominance in the region, and yet at the same time, different states have different kinds of dependency on India. The second dimension is mechanism, and here the author focuses on SAARC as a regional institution, and here she finds two separate divergent trends. One is the India eastward camp, and the second is the Pakistan westward camp. And the third dimension, the author looks at a kind of military thinking or bias, which is land first, sea later, or military first, bread later. Then the author goes on to make the claim that this kind of security architecture in South Asia cannot adapt to new security situations and demands, nor the needs of South Asian people for peace and sustainable development. And then she identifies three possible scenarios for the future. The first one is deteriorating, which means that things go bad from now on. The second one is basically status quo. And the third one is improving. I'm not going to go into the details of this because my critique is not focused on the details of the paper, but rather on the structure, the organizational concept of the paper. The author goes on to present China's Western development strategy as a way of dealing with the security architecture. And this Western development strategy means having an industrial link across East and South Asia, or what is called an industrial chain. The basic question that I have regarding this paper, which is relatively well written, it's written in excellent English, but the problem I have is with the conceptual architecture, one could say, of the paper, which is how does this Western development strategy of providing an industrial link across East and South Asia deal with the three main dimensions that the author begins the paper with. That is power, centered on Indian predominance, but with different kinds of dependencies of different states on India, SAARC with its divergent tendencies, and then the third area of idea, which is not very well explained. I'm not quite sure where this comes from. Is this military strategy, political ideology? The paper doesn't explain where this so-called idea comes from and how it fits in to the South Asian region as a whole. The fundamental question here is, how does what the author proposed address the problems that she identifies in the first part of the paper? And then behind this proposal is a question of, where does this proposal come from? What is the theoretical or philosophical, historical, cultural explanation for this proposal, and why it should address the problems that the paper raises? So those are my comments and presentation of the paper. So would Professor Madhu like to come up? Sorry.
Thanks. You know, Lily has laid out more or less the structure of the paper. And I just want to sort of add to that. And I won't repeat what she said because I'm entirely in agreement with her on the structure of the paper. But I do want to add to that the conceptual framework for the paper, really for young Xiaoping, is the notion of regionalism and security architecture. And she does define regionalism in South Asia as a closed regional system. And she also sort of extrapolates from that the regional system creates a certain kind of security architecture in South Asia. Oh, sorry. Now? Can you?
A little more slowly.
Oh, okay. I was sort of racing against 5 minutes. Okay. All right. So what I said was, you know, the conceptual framework for Yang Xiaoping's paper is really the notion of regionalism and security architecture, because she's actually looking at South Asian regionalism and the security architecture that emerges from that. Now, she defines South Asian regionalism as closed regionalism, and the idea of that regionalism rests on its own self-definition as a region. She looks at various definitions of regionalism, and she arrives at, and she picks from William Tao's definition of regionalism, which is really an overarching, coherent, broad understanding of security, and something that is distinct from multilateral security institutions. So in one sense, she has the broadest possible definition of what constitutes a region, i.e. South Asia. The other thing, of course, is that within that, she connects this to the security architecture, because she feels that that kind of regionalism, or that definition of a region in South Asia, actually indicates that there's a broader conception of security that emerges from that definition of regionalism. And of course, there are three dimensions, as Lily also pointed out: power, mechanism, and idea. Idea, I take to understand from Young's paper, has to do with the geopolitical understanding of what security has meant historically and currently. The power dimension, as she explains in the paper, is really related to the India-centric position, India's centrality to the regional framework, and also to the security framework in South Asia, where India can be seen as an opportunity, perhaps also as a threat, and India becomes the economic hub for South Asia. This suggests, as she points out, that there is an asymmetry in this definition of regional, and there is also a fractionalism, because smaller powers can see India as a threat. Therefore, states in South Asia have responded with different strategies, dependency, bandwagoning, outright opposition at times, right, and competition. Therefore, she extrapolates from that economic gains within SAARC as a consequence of this fractionalism have not translated into security solutions. And therefore, all of this undermines economic cooperation in the long run within the region. She looks at economic integration, and she sort of looks at the figures for economic integration and comes up with a rather dismal picture of how essentially unintegrated the South Asian regional economy is, although India is that driver in the regional economy. And she comes to a sort of surprising, for me, conclusion that if you sort of map the economic integration or non-integration, if you will, of South Asia, there is an eastward and a westward division. And now the westward division, according to her, is, I assume, and I gathered this from the paper, is Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the eastward division is, of course, India and all of the other, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc. Now, to my mind, and we'll come to that in a little while, that's a sort of weak argument because westward division, if it's only Pakistan and Afghanistan, it doesn't really constitute a bloc. Okay, thank you. Okay, now the other thing that Young says is that the idea dimension, and that's important really in her paper, is something that undermines regionalism in South Asia, and it also creates a sort of non-constructive, if you will, that's my term for it, security architecture. And what needs to be done is that the idea of comprehensive security needs to be added to notions of security within South Asia. And this is to offset the old security, geopolitical idea of security. The implications, of course, of a rising India for her, according to her, for the region are not completely optimistic, not completely constructive, in the sense that for smaller states, particularly Pakistan, and that's a focus in the paper quite surprisingly, I mean, not surprisingly maybe, particularly Pakistan actually deepens that east-west divide. And there are, of course, three scenarios, as Lily also pointed out: deterioration, improvement, and a status quo in the regional relationships within South Asia. And finally, she concludes the implications for India-China relations, where she feels that India could be part of the East Asian development, but she also, and this is a kind of surprising addition to the paper, she also concludes that South Asian regionalism may take off with third-party mediation. Now, she doesn't actually underline or highlight who that third party would be, but the assumption obviously is either US or China, right? Now, as a paper, I think it's very interesting, and I think some of the issues that come out of it, especially the conclusions that come out of it, are very interesting, because these are new ways of looking at what is happening in South Asia. And these are also, for India at least, sort of troubling ways of looking at what kind of regional structures are going to be created in South Asia. I mean, the idea of third-party mediation is a complete no-no, as we know, in Indian diplomacy and politics, right? It's actually happened on the ground. It happened with Kargil when the Americans came and pressured the Pakistanis. But at an official level, to accept third-party mediation in South Asian relations, whether they're bilateral or multilateral, is something I think the idea hasn't come at the right time yet. I mean, this is not the right time for the idea. That's one. The second thing, of course, is that in terms of what China gets to get out of the South Asian regionalism and the security architecture is also a little bit weak. I mean, the argument is a little bit weak because, as Lily said, the whole China westward expansion thing linking up with Indian industrialization the argument is a bit weak, because Indian industrialization would actually mean, linking up with Indian industrialization would actually mean that there would have to be complementarities and a certain horizontal and vertical movements in the entire Asian industrial process. That's not really happening on the ground vis-a-vis Chinese and Indian economic integration or cooperation or relations. I think what we're seeing is trade. What we're seeing is in the strategic economic dialogue that's now taking place, we're seeing a couple of moves towards opening up the Chinese market for Indian MNCs and enterprises. We're also seeing arguments about how to open up markets bilaterally, but not as a region. So I'm not sure whether this westward-eastward integration is actually an idea that needs, well, maybe it's an idea that needs to be worked out. It hasn't been worked out in the paper, really, essentially. And finally, I think what's central to this paper, what's good about the paper, as Lee said, was framework, structure, organization, writing. I think that's good, right? What's weak about the paper is really the assumption that regionalism anywhere, a region anywhere, is completely symmetrical and completely non-fractional. I think if you look at the ASEAN region, for example, it's certainly not symmetrical. I mean, China is a big driver. And with China and the other Asian states, Southeast Asian states, there are huge asymmetries in terms of economy, in terms of population, et cetera, et cetera. So to assume that South Asian regionalism has to be posited on a level of symmetry sort of begs the case about regionalism. Secondly, I think that, and this is really central to any idea of security architecture, I think if you look across the world and you see security architectures anywhere across the world, I think central to the validity of a security architecture and the credibility of it is the notion of a security community, right? The fact that states in that region must share more or less similar ideas of what constitutes security. And while they may have differences and there may be nuances in terms of prioritizing different issues as security, the basket of security issues must be more or less the same. And the concerns with stability, with growth, with power, with balancing, with hedging, must not ultimately, fundamentally upset the security agendas of states across the region. I don't think that's clearly emerging in South Asia. I think if you look at the issue of terrorism, you look at the issue of human security, you look at the issue of trafficking, a whole host of issues. I mean, rhetorically, I think we would all agree that these are common security issues. On the ground, how do different states in South Asia functionally deal with these issues? And I think the functional dealing with these issues is all very, very different, including the way that China deals functionally with these issues where South Asia is concerned. And fundamentally, I think one thing that makes the paper a little bit weak, it seems to me, is bringing the whole notion of Asian regionalism back into an India-Pakistan balance. I think we need to acknowledge somewhere, and this may be sort of controversial at this point perhaps, to acknowledge that the India-Pakistan balance is now a historical story, right? It's history, really. And the reason it's history is because of the fundamental diplomatic initiatives that India has taken in the last 10 years, and also the fundamental economic policies it has taken in the last 10 years, right? And as well, a third thing, the kind of downturn, political, economic, and security that has happened in Pakistan in the last 10 to 15 years. So I think if you look at the actual on-the-ground situation in India, you are going to find that this consistent thrust towards an India-Pakistan balance as far as China is concerned. I assume that's what the dominant thinking is coming from, right? It is something that needs to be examined much more closely, right? Now, in terms of, okay, sorry, am I completely out of time? Yes. All right, half a second. The other thing I want to sort of talk about is in the paper, and this is really a quibble, and you can go back to this and do this all over again, is if you look at the statistics you have, you don't give us a year for the statistics, right? The economic statistics. Secondly, if you look at, and you're talking about the fact that Pakistan and Afghanistan have this wonderful economic relationship, and the figures you give are extremely optimistic, but I think you need to break that down and see where that stuff is going to from Afghanistan. Is Pakistan just a transit country for those imports into Afghanistan, right? So are the US imports, are the Chinese imports? They're negligible Indian imports, of course, we know that, but are they coming from Saudi Arabia? Are they coming from West Asia? Where are they coming from? So is that really Pakistan-Afghanistan trade, or is that third-party trade with Afghanistan? So I think these things need to be examined, because in the sense, if you get your statistics right, it gives you a completely different picture of this westward camp that you sort of focus on. Thank you. Was I good time?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lily and Madhu, for helping us stay more or less within the time limit. May I now request Yang to briefly respond to the comments. Yang, if you could just come here so that Elmi and Anil can also listen to you.
Okay. Okay, really thanks for New School giving me this opportunity, and sincere thanks for two discussants, very constructive comments. Just very brief feedback. Firstly, the logic between the conception of the security architecture and the following three dimensions. I think the main purpose I choose this notion is I'm trying to establish an overarching framework to understand what is actually the security situations is in South Asia. Because I will find it's all complicated and all complex. I just want to have put them into 3 different dimensions and try to examine that differently. I agree that for the 3rd dimension, it's very weak. I will add some more supporting materials, especially from the official strategy paper and some authorized source. And also, I think one biggest problem is about whether Pakistan could be another semi-center in South Asia. I think this is why, I think this is also the biggest difference me as a Chinese perspective. When I'm doing this, actually there's one implications behind it is how could China to push the policy if we say it's a balanced South Asia policy forward, and how to try to be more specifically. If it's not wholly economically, but it's basically strategically. Thank you, and now I welcome the questions.
Thank you, Yang. I think we have about 15 minutes for a quick round of questions. May I again invite those who wish to make interventions or comments or questions to come up to the mic so that Anil and Elmi can also listen to you. We can take about 3 to 4 in a bunch and then give them a young opportunity to respond.
Hello. Again, I have to apologize for not being able to read the paper before making any comments. But the subject is of such immense importance that I want to ask questions, and a large number of questions, which come up out of the comments themselves. The first thing is, we talked about both the discussants said that you needed a conceptual framework or a stronger conceptual framework. It seems to me, first of all, did the paper take a conceptual framework for granted? Why do I ask this? Because if you look at South Asia, yes, of course, it's divided into a number of rather disputatious countries today. But historically, it has been one region for all except the last 60 years. And this is not it's been both a political region, a single political region for a large part of the last 2,000 years. It's been an economic single region for a very long time indeed. In fact, if you look at the work on Mughal history, you see that India had a very highly developed national market, a national financial system. Our banks, come money lender, come traders, were older than the Sumitomo Bank in Japan, which claims to be the world's first bank. And this was a single integrated functioning economy which was cut into 6 pieces during the period of colonialism. So if there's a conceptual framework within which we have to look at it, it is how are the 6 countries struggling with the legacy? And the answer is that they're trying to find a relationship once again with each other, which does not destroy their own newly born sense of nationhood. Now, in this, actually, we have matured enormously. And I think, therefore, the last 10 years, as Madhu said, just the last 10 years are terribly important to look at. I can speak more about India than about the other countries, but to some extent about Pakistan also. But the idea of non-reciprocity, India finally came to the conclusion, starting with the Farakka barrage, if you remember, in 1995 and 96, that we don't really need to extract something from the other countries when we make trade concessions or investment concessions or concessions like over the partition of waters and Farakka barrage, etc. That non-reciprocity principle has now been carried a very long way in terms of preferential trade arrangements, in terms of limited one-way free trade, free access to Indian markets, and now it's taken the last step, which I mentioned, which is the question of financial, financial accommodation for the other countries, using India's reserves. So I think that this may be a good conceptual framework within which to judge success and failure. The question that arises is, why is it necessary always to ask this, to balance India and China in South Asia? Why don't we balance India and China in South China Sea? Why has that question not been asked here? There's one reference to it, and actually slightly wrong, slightly misleading one by Prasenjit Dwara yesterday, but that's all we've had so far. It is not necessary for every country to be present in every part of the world. So therefore, I think that we do need to have that conceptual framework and say, well, is there a norm we must first define, and to what extent are we deviating from the norm? What are the causes of the deviation, and to what extent are we trying to come back and to restore the norms? Thank you.
I'd just like to add a point, since we have a little bit of time. I was really constrained by time. Your premise of a closed regional security zone needs to be questioned. No security zone is closed. No system is closed, in fact. We all live and operate in an open system that has dynamics within it. To claim that a system is closed is really to take it out of an ecosystem. So I would like you to address that.
Just very, very brief feedback. Why I mentioned close here, actually, I'd like to say that, especially in China, the Chinese version of this paper has been published in China. Actually, I think the key contributions that I have done in that paper is, I'd like to tell those who work in academies that when they are studying South Asia, you have to say, actually, it is very special, and it it's a different thinking, especially when you are trying to examine it with Southeast Asia. The second is feedback is about, yes, there are disagreements on whether South Asia is actually historical utility or actually it's a fragmentation. As I'm still very junior here, because before I didn't focus on India, so I think the perspectives of India is very important for me to shape the future thinking of South Asia and India. And I will also very open to accept this perspective. But I think for fragmentation, also get some support from American scholars. This argument also supported by the Strategic Asia report from Carnegie Endowment Center in 2012, co-edited by Ashley Tallis. And the main argument of South Asia, it is actually fragmented. And yes, I agree that China and India could cooperate and should cooperate in South Asia and in the whole Asia. But I think when we are coming to South Asia, two key issues we have to try to get the wisdom to solve. One is Pakistan. That is where India and Pakistan will get full reconciliation in the future. And also, I think China, personally, I think China will welcome this kind of whole recognition. The second is, how could India really perceive China's role in SAARC? In what kind of situation could China be given full membership? Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Just a question. Something I wanted to raise and I sort of left out because I was sort of rushing against time. You know, I'm sort of wondering whether you want to cast your paper within the context of China's redefining its South Asia policy. And for a long time, China's South Asia policy was be friends with Pakistan, constrain India. Okay? That in the recent past has changed, obviously. And I'm sort of wondering whether its new interest in South Asia as a region, its new interest in SAARC, the mechanisms of conciliation, cooperation in South Asia have a great deal to do with this kind of redefinition of what it today calls its South Asia policy, which is to actually look at South Asia as an arena and not to look at this India-Pakistan relationship, which it can use instrumentally for its own, geopolitical reasons as, a part of its South Asia policy. Right? So maybe you want to do that. I'm sort of wondering why you haven't done that, I guess. Okay. Right, thank you.
Well, thank you. When you talk about the security architecture of South Asia, I think we should really take into consideration about what is happening in South Asia and what has happened in the last 2 decades. I would feel there are 3 significant changes we have been watching as academics in South Asia. 3 significant changes have taken place. One is there's a tremendous domestic pressure on each country in South Asia to open up. Open up in terms of political participation, in terms of security interest, and in terms of economic liberalization, right? This is one, and that has been very clearly reflected on what has happened to a process like SAARC. It has gone up from what you call the preferential trading arrangement to the free trade area, soon expecting common market to happen, and ultimately the South Asian Union. Second is the policy makers in South Asia. The second generation is taking over. A new generation is taking over. And nobody really has noticed this. If you see a country like India or even a country like Pakistan, you'll find a new generation taking over the entire what you call political bureaucratic regime and policy regimes, and even in the civil society and the business circle. And that has brought about a huge openness. And the third, which is taking place, is now the South Asian countries have increasingly realized the fact that there are serious challenges to South Asian security from outside what you call the traditional orthodox variety of security. You have a large number of security issues coming up, which are not of the orthodox military variety, right? You have security questions. So I think these 3 have a direct and substantive, what you call it, implications on the South Asian security architecture. This has to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. I'm sorry if there are any more questions, we won't be able to take them in this round. Perhaps in the next session, if you could just hold on to those.